Before we had learned that the inside of a square root must always be a positive number. But now we're going to learn that that is not always going to be true. You can have a negative inside of the square root, but it just won't be a real number. So the square root of -1, we are going to say that that is equal to I, an imaginary number. So the square root of -1 equals I. What that means then is if I square both sides, so if I have the square root of -1 and I square that, and I square I, that means that I squared is equal to -1. Any real number you do that to won't work out because any negative times a negative is positive or positive times a positive is positive. So that is why we introduce the concept of I. So whenever you have a negative inside your square root, it can be brought out as an I. So let's take a look at some examples. If I have the square root of -4, that can be written as the square root of -1 times 4. The square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of -1 is I. So that means the square root of -4 is 2I. If you have the square root of -9, then that would be the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of a negative is I. So that means that if you are dealing with any square root, you can simplify it whether it has a positive or a negative inside. So if I have the square root of -500, we can rewrite that as -100 times 5. The square root of 100 is 10. The square root of a negative is I. And then you cannot take the square root of 5, so that is our final answer. Let's take a look at one more example like that. If I have the square root of -54, we can rewrite that. The perfect square that is in with 54 is 9 times 6. And we end up with 3I square root of 6. And that would be the final simplification of that problem.